We were here together for 3 years as undergraduates. I mean, one could have a whole interview about that, but can you pick out something about the atmosphere of Worcester this is 1960 to 63, or any particular events that you remember as important to you subsequently or at the time? I mean, in other words, just say anything you like about those 3 years, because there's so much to say, really.
Well, I mean, I made good friends. I suppose my closest friends were people like John Monks and Peter Gooden and Mark Cullingham.
These are all people who are reading English.
Yes, for some. Well, John was reading English, and therefore the others were, and Alistair and yourself. I suppose the thing that brings back those years is actually a piece of music, because in the very first summer, I remember, Mark Cullingham had, I think it was a college rented house in Wellington Square, and Mark was a very, very keen enthusiast for a piece of music I had never heard before and always associated with that summer, which is Prokofiev's Classical Symphony. And funnily enough, I was just driving yesterday to go and get a prescription for my wife, and it came on Classic FM, and straight away I was back in that summer of 1961, the first summer we were here. That I remember. The other thing I remember is sitting in the lower library after I'd won the Webb Medley Prize and was thinking I had a golden future ahead of me, and the Cuban Missile Crisis appeared, and I can remember looking out over this very quadrangle thinking, crikey, this is all going to be vaporized fairly soon, and that was quite a scary bit.
This is spring 1963.
Yeah, well, whatever, yes.
And that was the cold winter. It was the two things.
And that very cold winter, yes, that's true. I mean, it's really episodic, my memory. Sounds, smells, but of course, since I've been here continuously since, there's a sense in which any memory I have may well be overlain with things that have happened subsequently, so that I wouldn't rely on it as a memory of myself as an undergraduate, because in a sense I've never quite distanced myself in the way that the rest of you have from where I've been an undergraduate. But I think acting, or at least not acting in my case, well, acting in the very first term in a thing called the Apollo of Bellac, which was directed by Henry Weiss, who was a senior status guy who lived in our house, because we lived in 20 Worcester Place with Mark Davis and John Monks and Henry and me.
This is just down, turn left, and you had a room on the left.
Absolutely.
I spent a lot of time
That's
there.
right. No. Again, I remember it as a kind of happy time. I've had a boringly happy life, I'm afraid, in many ways. I mean, there have been black periods in it, but broadly speaking, it's been...
We always had there were several things I remember about you. One was that you had a cheerful and sunny disposition.
Yes.
And the other was the great art of effortless superiority, in the sense that you never seemed to do any work. And yet you won these prizes and got firsts, and we all sweated away and got seconds.
Yeah, I don't know about that. One person I can remember is Paul Hyams.
Yes.
And I remember him irritating the hell out of me, and I suspect contributed to quite a number of us doing better than we otherwise would have done by wandering round and criticising. He would come into your room while you were writing an essay and pick up, one of the pieces of paper you'd let fall on the floor, and start to read it and say, no, that's not right, or whatever, in a very Hyams-ish way. So he was an influence.
He was a pace setter. I mean,
yes, he was.
Many. I mean, James Campbell decided I was faltering and might achieve something, so he put me with Paul for about a year, side by side. And of course, you can imagine Paul's essays and Paul's kindly elderly brother comments on my essays and what I was doing wrong, which I think must have helped enormously.
Yes, I mean, I think that's one of the things we didn't have at Worcester in those days, and we do have in Worcester now, which is a sense that quite a lot of people are going to get firsts, and that becomes cumulative. I mean, now, admittedly, the number of firsts overall has gone up considerably, but now something over a third of the college gets firsts, and there is a palpable intellectual atmosphere in the college, which I, of course, welcome. But I don't think there was in those days. I mean, I remember the year, funnily enough, my memory of being an undergraduate is more concentrated on the people in the year ahead of us, people who were very rich and pretty stupid. No, I won't say who they were, but I remember, you remember we had collections in the upper senior common room, and you used to stand on the stairs waiting for collections, and they were always late, I remember. And this particular group of rather well-heeled young men were kind of ahead of us on the stairs, and they used to be chattering away about, I wonder what the poor old fool will say about my work this term. And then after they'd gone in and had their collection, they'd come out rather quiet and and go back down the stairs again, and then resume whatever hijinks they were up to in Pump Quad, because they all had rather grand rooms in Pump Quad.
What was the difference between those years then? I mean, were they they'd done national service?
A lot of them had, of course, hadn't they? There was a big gap between ourselves and the second year, because most of the second year had done national service, and very few of us had. I think Chris Power had. There were one or two others I remember, but that must have been as big a gap as for a long time between one generation and another. So they seemed considerably older.
Did you one of the things I remember most was that suddenly there was a sense of liberation, because at a northern boarding school, for instance, we weren't allowed to know of the existence of girls. So coming to Oxford was the first real experience of girlfriends. We couldn't entertain really, and I went out and bought cups at Woolworths with spotted black and white cups and entertained in my room, and could give people sherry. And so suddenly you were a young gentleman, and people called you sir. And, you seemed to take a huge step up a ladder into a free, open world, which out of a closed kind of world of a boarding school. Did you sense this?
Yes, because the atmosphere in my school was very much of a boarding school. I mean, I rarely got home much before 6 o'clock at night, and then I'd have a couple of hours homework to do. So home was where you slept. We had school on Saturdays, all Saturday. So and when I became a senior boy, there was morning service on a Sunday as well. So I might as well have been at a boarding school.
Although the torture of the dormitories was
exactly, the torture of the dormitories was missing. That's perfectly true. And it is true, yes, it was liberating. I mean, being at a day school, I had encountered girls, knew what they were, and so on. But I agree with you, it was very liberating. And it's one of the things that's very different about undergraduates now, which is that they have free and easy relationships already before they come up. And I think this is rather charming in a way. They don't want to distance themselves from their parents in the same way that you and I did. I mean, you came up, you sent a trunk on in advance, and you were here for 8 weeks.
It was embarrassing if your parents came.
Very embarrassing if your parents came up. Your parents were immensely embarrassing. Whereas I meet parents, of course, because we have these parents' guest nights every term, and the parents become very integrated into the college, and I observe how how often they know their friends, their children's friends, for example, quite well. Obviously, there's a lot of staying with people and so on, and I think that's really very pleasant. But of course, the parents now have themselves been to university, quite a lot of them, not necessarily to Oxford or Cambridge, but they've been to university and they have some notion of what it is they have to do. And if there's a danger, it's sometimes that they try and interfere too much, not that they're remote like my parents certainly were, not that they were not loving and so on, but they were just 200 miles away and you didn't go.
And as you say, many of them hadn't been to university, so when they came, they were embarrassing because they didn't know how to talk or behave.
Yeah, not so much that, but well, as I said, my father was just, on the whole, supremely indifferent to universities. He once said to me after I'd become a Don, "What do you do all day, you people?" He said, "You just stand around and talk." So I have never grown up with a great sort of respect in that sense, awe of universities at all.
When you started by saying the friendships, I mean, I think that's probably the thing that most...
there are two things that people remember about Worcester, and I'm no exception, are the people you were with, the friends, and some people like Alistair and so on, Ewan Porter, John Monks, obviously, you, and so on. The other is the sheer beauty of the place, and that is something that Worcester people remember in a way that I doubt whether people at Exeter or Jesus or Lincoln, well, possibly Lincoln, because that jewel of a little quad, but otherwise not. And that's one of the things I shall miss when I leave this house, is the setting sun catching the stone, and it is absolutely beautiful. So it is a lovely place to be.
And somehow, because Oxford, certainly for me, from the Dragon onwards, was associated with a kind of fairyland, because I was in love with romantic poetry and children's stories and Alice and so on. And the fact that the little tunnel way, I was told, had been the one that inspired Lewis Carroll to the entry to Wonderland and so on. The whole thing sort of, you seem to be on the edge of another mysterious and more beautiful kind of gypsy scholar kind of world, which few of the colleges have that. They're much more...
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I can remember, do you remember they did, again, Mark Cullingham producing it, they did Ring Round the Moon.
I do.
And I think they used that big plane tree in the garden, didn't they, and lit the bark. And I never pass it without thinking of that. So,
and one or two of the Shakespeare they did out on the lake.
Absolutely. Well, that was always Coghill, wasn't it? That was his trademark.
So there was a sort of magic.
Yes, and there still is. The famous production that Coghill did, which he did in 47, 48, before our time, which more people claim to have seen than can possibly ever have done it, which is the famous production of The Tempest, in which Ariel, and the final scene, runs across the lake on a platform underneath the water, and then up into the trees on the far side of the lake. Some years ago, the cast reassembled under the tutelage of Godfrey Smith, who used to be the editor of the Sunday Times colour comic, who's an old member. And Ariel was still alive and stood at the edge of the lake and recited his final speech, and there was not a dry eye in the house. There really wasn't. And I was there as a guest, and my eyes went dry, and I never saw it.
Yes, we heard all these stories. And one of the abiding memories, we'd have lunch or breakfast, and then we'd sort of pair up, and then we would go walking round and round the grounds, discussing life and
things. And do you remember War on Want lunches too?
Yes.
That Alistair and I used to go and buy huge quantities of cheese from and the college allowed you to opt out of your meal plan and credited the War on Want with you remember?
And Oxfam was starting then.
That's
I used
right.
to go and work in the first Oxfam office.
Sure.
though it was anyway. This is interesting for us, but perhaps not. We better not go on too much about it. You then went on to Nuffield to do a PhD, or DPhil.
Yes, that was the idea, that I would do a DPhil. I went to Nuffield on a Milk Marketing Board scholarship in agricultural economics. By this stage, I had met my first wife, and she was already well on the way to completing her course as a social worker. And in a rather old-fashioned, perhaps it wasn't old-fashioned in those days, view, I thought I ought to contribute to the family budget. So I looked around for a lucrative postgraduate award, and the most lucrative awards were both in agricultural economics, one from the Pig Industry Development Authority, I remember, and the other from the Milk Marketing Board. And I got the Milk Marketing Board one, and they wanted to send me to Manchester University, which had a very good reputation for agricultural economics. But by that stage, I also got into Nuffield, and the warden of Nuffield, I think, intervened on my behalf, and the Milk Marketing Board scholarship was transferred to here. And I went to see a man called Terence Gorman, who was the professor of mathematical economics, and he gave me a very, very bad piece of advice. I said, look, I'm a classicist by training, originally at school. I happen to have been good at economics, but I know it's a fluke. If I'm going to be an economist, I absolutely have got to do mathematical economics. I must learn that. And Terence, who's a supreme and sublime mathematician, but a lovely, genial Irishman, said, why would you want to do that? I won't try and put his accent on, but why would you want to do that? If you learn mathematics for 2 years, all you'll ever be is a third-rate mathematical economist. Why not be a first-rate non-mathematical economist? And that was a very bad piece of advice. I should have done what I'd intended to do and really learnt the grammar of mathematical economics. I taught economics pretty well for 10 years, I think, but by the end of that, as it were, my cover had been blown. I don't think I would have been fit to teach undergraduates much more. No, because the subject was moving on and in ways that I could not really follow.
That's interesting. What was the thesis on?
Oh, well, I had to do something which would suit the Milk Marketing Board. So I did my thesis on the use of American food surpluses under their Public Law 480, PL 480 food surplus, as aid to developing countries, and I was comparing the direct aid from America bilaterally to countries through PL 480 with a more roundabout route where they gave PL 480 supplies to the newly established World Food Programme, which is part of the UN FAO, and then the FAO then distributed the food. And I looked at projects in Turkey, which was extremely interesting, and I also looked at what was going on in Rome and in the FAO headquarters. 2 or 3 times Alistair and I drove down to Italy, he to go to the British School and me to work in FAO. But then I got a fellowship at St Edmund Hall. I mean, these were extraordinary days because all a generation of people teaching at London, Oxford and Cambridge went off to be the new professors in the new universities, Sussex, Essex, Warwick, Kent, whatever. Dick Sargent, who has been my tutor here, went to be the first professor of economics at Warwick. John Vasey, who succeeded him here, went off fairly quickly to be professor of economics at Brunel. My graduate supervisor, who was a fellow of St Edmund Hall, was unsettled by all this, but he moved in a different way. He became the chief economist of a big American multinational food industry company called W.R. Grace. And so he left, and I more or less stepped into his shoes as fellow and tutor in economics at St Edmund Hall. But the days were very, very different in those days, because I remember being interviewed for a post in economic history, which in retrospect would have been a good post to take, but at St Peter's, a fellowship in economic history, and the chairman of the selection committee was none other than Professor Sir John Hicks, Oxford's only genuine Nobel Prize winner in economics. I said to John Hicks, I don't know any economic history, and he said, oh, you could get it up. So it was a very different world, I think, in those days. And then after a couple of years at Teddy Hall, then when John Vasey left here and went back to Brunel, I was asked to come back here, and I had a curious non-interview interview. I was already a fellow of another college, so they couldn't interview me, and I knew I was meeting the interview panel, and the interview panel knew that I knew that I was being interviewed by the interviewed panel, but neither side could kind of quite say this, so we discussed how in principle one might teach economics.
Were there other people interviewed?
Yes. As always in Oxford, you discover who it was later. Some of them much more distinguished than me, and most of them, I'm pleased to say, got other jobs at inferior colleges, like much richer ones. But the effect on my PhD was that my then university supervisor, a lovely man called Arthur Hazelwood, who was a fellow of Pembroke, but a very non-interventionist supervisor, said to me, now you're going to stop doing your DPhil, aren't you? And I said, why would I do that? And he said, two reasons. One is you'll be teaching so much you won't possibly have time to finish it. And secondly, he said, in any case, it would be indecent if you got one. And this is about 1966, 7. And not a single member of the economics faculty in Oxford had a doctorate. Nobody.
In fact, it would rather lower your status than...
Well, I don't know quite that. I mean, it had moved on from that. There certainly had been a time when it would have been a mark of somebody coming from an inferior university that they needed to be called a doctor. But that was another mistake, a very bad mistake, not to do it. I got a long way in it, and at the suggestion of my non-interventionist supervisor, I did write a long, boring article about my thesis. Now, that was actually also a mistake, because once, in a sense, the theme of your thesis is out in the public domain, there's not much point in finishing the thesis, because you've made your contribution to scholarship or whatever it is, and mine wasn't very significant. It's been cited a couple of times, but that's about it. But I had 26 files of material in my attic, and I had a letter from a graduate student at St Andrews who said he understood I had a lot of unpublished material about the early years of the World Food Programme, and I said yes. Could he come and read it? Of course. And I liked him a lot, and I said to him, why don't you just take it? So I gave it to him.
And he used it?
Yes, he did. He got he actually transferred from St Andrews to Cambridge and got a Cambridge doctorate. Wrote a book about it afterwards. It has a nice thank you to me in the beginning. But I felt so relieved this albatross had gone from round my neck. I didn't have the doctorate hanging over me, accusingly sitting in files.
Was it the waste aspect, or was it that it would have been useful to be doctor?
Oh, I think it would have been useful to be doctor, because I've just been completely overtaken by events. I mean, nobody can teach in university in Britain now without the meal ticket, in a way.
But your colleagues, I mean, the James Campbells and the Harry Pitts and the...
But they're that much older, Alan. I mean, I remember you always were set on doing a doctorate, and you were right.
I did too.
Yeah, I know. You were absolutely right.
Laying up treasures upon earth.
Well, it's also it's an investment. I mean, in there's a sense in which every job I've had, I have felt, crikey, that was lucky.
If only they knew.
Yeah, exactly. Mm.
So, did you come back to Worcester because of sentimental reasons, or was it a better job? Or
not really.
Teddy Hall
was very nice. I was just flattered to be asked, probably.
Did you know G.D. Ramsay at all?
Yes, absolutely.
He taught me at Teddy Hall.
Yeah, he's a lovely guy, and a Worcester man.
Was he?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I mean, he taught me the wool industry in Wiltshire.
That's great.
Then didn't you? Perhaps it was from here that you were involved with the Treasury.
Yeah, that was after a couple of years, and I went on secondment, part-time secondment to the Treasury for what in the end turned out to be about 3 years. It happened. Everything in my life, Alan, happens entirely by accident. This was the result of an ill-judged question at a seminar. There was and still is a thing in Oxford called the Oxford University Business Summer School. It's called something different now. It's called the University Summer Economics Programme. It's aimed at bright young businessmen who've not done economics. It's an intensive course of economics, in those days lasting a month. And the pattern in those days anyway was that you had plenary lectures. There are about 45 candidates or something like that. You have plenary lectures and you divide into syndicates of about 10 or 12. That happens in the morning, and in the afternoon people do their own homework and so on, and in 5 o'clock there's another lecture, and then after dinner somebody from the real world talks about whatever you've been dealing with in the day. And one of the tutors is in charge of the evening session. It's a very, very intensive and very hard work, but it's extremely well paid, or was. And I was on duty when Sir Donald McDougall, the government chief economic advisor, gave an after-dinner talk. And Donald had a very quiet voice anyway, and he was a pretty unimpressive speaker. And we all used to sit around on sort of armchairs. This was in Merton, as I recall it, not on sort of ergonomically designed lecture theatre chairs as one would be in now. And pretty well the whole audience was snoozing. And Donald got to the end of what he had to say, and I clearly had to ask a question, because there clearly wasn't going to be one from the floor. And I said, Sir Donald, would you care to look over the edge of the abyss and tell us how deep it is? And this is 1968. And he looked at me for a long minute, and then he said, I have never believed the view common amongst economists that a country cannot go bankrupt. Now, he did not know, but that very morning I'd been lecturing on international economics, and I had said, it is ludicrous to think that countries can go bankrupt. And of course, these are bright young men. I mean, admittedly, well, there were some women, but mostly men. And they were snoozing, but they weren't snoozing that much. So they woke up and then plied him with the most torrid set of questions for about half an hour till I could bring it to an end about what he meant. And so I found myself, this is a bit of local colour, in the next stall to Donald after the lecture, peeing with him. And I said, I'm terribly sorry to have asked you that question. I thought I was giving you a half volley on the leg stump. And he said, you'd better come and find out how difficult it is. And I said, oh, that'd be very interesting. And he said, do you mean that? And I said, yeah. And a month later I was in the Treasury.
A lovely story. And what did you find?
Well, I found I was put in a thing called FH2, which stood for Home Finance, or more accurately, Finance Home, second group. We reported to a really bright young thing called Robert Armstrong. And we did monetary policy. I was there put in at Donald's request, in order to shadow a really bright young Treasury official called Andrew Edwards, who was strongly suspected of being at least a covert, if not a real monetarist. And this is the days, the height of the monetarist Keynesian debate. And I have always been a very strong believer in the views of that great fellow of kings. So I was put in really to shadow Andrew Edwards. Now, he was much too clever a civil servant not to know that, and equally much too clever a civil servant not to circumvent me perfectly easily. But nevertheless, I did monetary policy, and I found myself part of a group which redesigned the control of the UK banking system, which was one of the specialisms I lectured on in the university. We devised between us the thing known as competition and credit control, which was promulgated in 1971, I think. And it was an interesting time, really interesting. The IMF was around. And of course, the great delight, apart from Donald McDougall, who was wonderful, had this wonderful way of guessing at forecasts and so on, and would draw on his pipe and use a kind of petrol lighter, which he managed nearly always practically to burn the Treasury down each time he lit his pipe. But the other great delight, the person I worked with more than anybody else, was Michael Posner.
Oh, right.
And he was just wonderful.
Was he at Cambridge then?
Yes, he was. Yeah. But he was a very Oxford man at Cambridge, I have to say. I think he was regarded with some suspicion by the more cerebral Cambridge economists as not quite up to the mark. And of course, at Cambridge at the time, and has been ever since, was one of my Nuffield contemporaries, namely Bob Rowthorne.
Oh, right. I've interviewed him.
Right. Well, I don't know what he thinks about Nuffield, but he was what I should have turned myself into, namely a mathematical economist.
Well, that's 3 years, so we better move back. You stopped doing that after 3 years. How big a gap was there between that and becoming provost? When did you become provost?
Oh, not till 1991. It's a long gap. We're talking about
fit in a little bit of
20 years. Okay, well, I came back to Oxford and taught. Fairly soon after that, I was asked out of the blue to go and have lunch in London with a company which was facing arraignment before the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. And I said, this is not me, I'm not a microeconomist. And they said, we understand that you're a very good teacher, and that's exactly what we need, because we have to convince the Monopolies Commission, and these people are not technical economists. So I said, okay, well, tell me a bit about it. And I went to lunch, and the company turned out to be the Pedigree Pet Foods division of Mars, Mars being the international confectionery and food industry company. And I remember saying to them, well, before I agree to do anything, let's just get clear what you're going to define as success. And they said, 100% clean bill of health. And I said, what? You have, I can't remember now the figures, but it was something of the order of 37% of the market and return on capital employed of 52% or something really ridiculous. And I said, there's no way we're going to get a clean bill of health with those figures. But 2.5 years later, we did. And that was very stimulating. I was working with Jeremy Lever, who was the QC, fellow of All Souls, very bright, having done the MPhil in economics some years before, I think. And a man called John Swift, who was his junior, who also became a very leading QC and so on. They were a very good team. And as I say, the result of all that was that, somewhat amazingly, we got away with a clean bill of health, and The Monopolies Commission works a bit like a law court. There's a certain sort of adversarial system in it. And once the case was over, I let it be known to various friends from the Treasury that I thought we had been allowed to get away with various arguments we really should not have been allowed to get away with. And I was summoned to see the minister, and I assumed it was to talk about the deficiencies of the Government Economic Service, and to my astonishment he said, what would you bring to the Monopolies Commission? And I said, how do you mean? He said, well, as a member. And I said, well, right at this minute, Minister, a strong sense of the absurd. He said, you're hired. So I found myself on the Monopolies Commission, and that was a part-time job, and I did various cases, including on my 40th birthday writing a memorandum of dissent on a Monopolies Commission case involving banks, interestingly enough, where I argued that the Hong Kong and Shanghai bank should be allowed to take over, or should be allowed to bid for a British bank in order to introduce more competition. Shades of the present day. And gradually I got more and more senior in the commission, and again, as a result of an accident, the chief administrator of the Monopolies Commission is called the secretary. I don't know whether it still is, but it was called the secretary, which always caused companies we went to visit a great deal of difficulty, because if they had to put us up in a hotel or somewhere, they usually thought the secretary was somebody very junior. So the secretary was a very senior civil servant. Often had to change rooms with the most junior civil servant. And I said to the secretary after one hearing, which had been extremely badly handled by one of the deputy chairmen who was chairing the particular inquiry, who had really let a company off the hook, having got them into a really point where they could have been made to say some interesting things and let them off. I said, God, I was so cross. I said, if I couldn't do it better than that, I'd be shot. And the secretary said, what did you say? And I said it again, slightly less exasperatedly. And he said, you do know that there's going to be a vacancy in a month for a deputy chairman? And I said, no, I had no idea. And he said, well, if you're willing to have your name put forward, we'll put it forward. And so I became deputy chairman, which I did for 3 years. But at the same time, I was running the Department for Continuing Education. I'd stopped being a tutorial fellow here, as I said to you, partly because I really felt that I was getting to the point where I wasn't really capable of teaching really bright undergraduates. So I stopped teaching in '76 and took on the role of director of the Department for External Studies, as it was called in those days, the university's continuing education department. I'd always done a lot of lecturing for adult groups for the Workers' Educational Association and so on. I really, really enjoyed teaching adults. So I opted for that job in '76 and got it. So I was running a university department, which is largely an administrative job, though in order to stop my colleagues saying that you have no idea what it's like to drive out on a damp night in November, I used to do that and used to enjoy doing that. I was still in the university, and having been chairman of the Social Studies Faculty Board, well, chairman of economics at one point, and then chairman of the Social Studies Faculty Board, and so on, I was on a thing called the General Board of Faculties. The Monopolies Commission job was 3 years. I had 3 years leave of absence as director of my department. In the last year of that, I was told that the chairman wanted to apply for me to stay on for a longer period. But I didn't hear anything, and I didn't hear anything, and I didn't hear anything. meanwhile, the General Board was busy electing its next chairman, and they asked me to do the job, and I said I would, assuming that I wouldn't be asked to go on the Monopolies Commission. And 2 days later, a letter which had been misdirected, shows what government computers are like. It had actually been sent to my address from when I'd been a young man in the Treasury. Caught up with me, and it said, will you stay on the Monopolies Commission as Deputy Chairman for another 3 years? But by that stage I'd said to the university that I'd come back as Chairman of the General Board, so that's what I did. And I wrote to Angus Maud, I can't remember, Maud, saying I'm very sorry, I agreed to go back to the university and I can't go back on that. So I became Chairman of the General Board for 2 years, and while I was doing that job, I was asked whether I would allow my name to go forward as Provost, and I said yeah. So
that's how it happened.
That's how it happened. I've only recently discovered who my two rivals were.
Are you allowed to say? Or?
I don't think I should, but I do. One of them subsequently became a head of another college, and is, alas, now dead. Was an excellent head of that college, and would have been an excellent head of this one.
I think last night it was mentioned something about the Vice Chancellorship. You were a contender for that.
Well, you aren't a contender as such. This is a long time ago. This is when Colin Lucas became Vice Chancellor. John Hood's difficult regime was about the last 5 years. Colin Lucas, I think, did 7, didn't he? So we must be talking about, oh, goodness me, well, 1990 something. 6, 7, 8. Yes, I didn't get the job. I mean, if I'm absolutely frank, I would not have got me to that far.
Sounds like Groucho Marx.
Yeah, exactly. I was disappointed in the way that one is, but I wasn't in the sort of David Miliband stage of disappointment. And in many ways it's turned out very much for the better, because I've hugely enjoyed the job here, and I'm not sure I would have enjoyed being, probably.
Would you have had to give up, or you wouldn't have been Provost if you'd done that?
Well, in those days, the Vice Chancellor did retain whatever substantive job he had, so that Colin Lucas remained Master of Balliol. But you kind of, it's very difficult, or was in those days in the regime, for the college, because they have to appoint somebody in your stead. And the advantage is that the Vice Chancellor gets to use his official residence associated with his college job, whereas when the possibility was being contemplated of having a so-called professional Vice Chancellor, the university bought a house for the Vice Chancellor up the Banbury Road, which is nice, but not a patch on this, for example, or the Master's Lodgings at Jesus or whatever.
I mean, just on the Vice Chancellorship, you were. We've talked about the difficult years of Hood. You taught.
I did. Yes, he was my graduate student, and what's more, I was on the committee that appointed him.
Yes, and visited him in Australia before.
This is him in New Zealand.
Oh, New Zealand.
Yes, yes.
I mean, why was it difficult? He tried to change the university very considerably, didn't he, in a short time? Was that the difficulty?
No. I think he misread the situation when he came in. The university's finances were extremely foggy. We had done exactly the same thing that our distinguished sister university had done, which is to introduce a new accounting system based on Oracle. And when we went into this, we said, we'll avoid all those mistakes that Cambridge made. And lo and behold, we did not. And at the time, the management of the university's finance division was not up to the task. John interpreted this, I think, as evidence of a deep structural weakness in the way the university worked, and sought to impose a different model, essentially a North American state university model, where there would be a kind of board of regents and so on. Well, let's leave that aside for a minute. What was actually flawed was his reading of the situation, because one of the good things he did, and it could be said about John that he was absolutely first-rate chief financial officer, perhaps not quite the temperament and personality to be a good chief executive officer or chairman. But he appointed a very good director of finance, and lo and behold, the fog lifted. The university had a miraculous turnaround one year from the other, suggesting, as it were, that the situation had never been as bad in the first place. But John persisted with his deep structural reforms and was defeated by congregation.
And quite a lot of the opposition was from this college.
Yeah, that was interesting. And I didn't believe it at first. As it happened, I had a pulmonary embolism and then pneumonia in the spring of that year when John was introducing his reforms. And there's a sense in which I was just missing for, I don't know, 12 weeks, something like that. And when I got out of hospital, almost the first phone call I had was from the head of another college, who said, "You must call your dogs off, Dick." And I said, "What dogs are those?" And this person said, "The people who are persecuting John Hood and making his life a misery." And I said, no, you've got it, that can't be right. They're not fellows of this college. Worcester is the most politically apathetic college. The fellows are busy doing their own things. You must have mistaken us. But I was wrong. There were at least two fellows of the college who were very, very strongly in the inner group which opposed John. But I certainly was not going to, it wouldn't have done any good anyway. You can't call your dogs off. They're not my dogs. But quite apart from anything else, I thought, although I thought sometimes their tactics were not wonderful, I thought they were right. That John was trying to reform the university in a way which cut across the grain of the university. And the notion that the university is full of silly old fuddy-duddies who were all right-wing and so on is just absurd. I mean, the whole political centre of your university and this university will be to the left of centre by quite a long way. So it's not that they're not capable of radical thinking. It just is that they were not convinced that this model with kind of a board of trustees and then various things under it was what was required. And I think they were right. Whereas Alison Richard, John's counterpart in a sense in Cambridge, I think went about things much more quietly.
Very tactfully.
And really rather well.
Yes, she's wonderful.
So, damn it, you got the right, we didn't.
I mean, was part of it, one of the differences between Oxford and Cambridge, as I've observed it, is the relationship between the university and the colleges. That is to say, the colleges here seem to be much more powerful and autonomous.
Well, now that's funny, because as we look at Cambridge, it always looks exactly the other way around. That is, it looks as if we're weak and you're strong. You're certainly richer on the whole than Oxford colleges are. Certainly Trinity is far richer than St John's, which is the richest of the lot. I don't know. I mean, it is true, of course, there is the joint appointment system in Oxford, which there isn't in Cambridge. And what I didn't do when we were talking about the background to my being a candidate as Vice-Chancellor is that I'd been on the North Committee, which proposed reforms to the way Oxford worked. I voted in the end for the continuation of the joint appointment system. If I was now on a committee, I would not. I think that there are advantages and disadvantages in both systems, and I think myself now that the balance has shifted in favour of the Cambridge system rather than the Oxford system. No, I don't think it had anything to do with joint appointments. It had to do with essentially whether you think that academics are capable of governing themselves, and I think they are. And what's more, I think it's better if they do. And I worry about the increasing incidence of, quotes, professional managers, even in universities. And that's probably because, although I've been a strong supporter of management studies in Oxford and have taught quite a lot for the predecessors of the Said Business School, the Oxford Centre for Management Studies and Templeton College, I really do not believe there is much scientific about management science, and I basically don't believe that there are a set of kind of transferable skills which can be moved from the health service one week to running something else another week, and then to running a major company, and then running a university. I think this is rubbish. I think you have to understand properly, down to quite a fine level of detail, what it is you're trying to manage. And I think that's often better done by people who know where the bodies are, essentially.
Well, that very conveniently takes us into the last 10 minutes, and the last thing I wanted to talk about. What is it that you're trying to manage as Provost of Worcester College for 20 years? What is the...
I don't think I'm trying to manage anything, Alan. What am I trying to
do?
Facilitate, I think. I think this is the Smethurst theory of academic management, if you like. I don't think that you are managing in the sense that you would be managing a company, anything. I have sometimes said it to John Hood, who wasn't very pleased about it, that you are actually managing a shopping mall. It is where it is. It's not going to move anywhere else. It's here. Your job is to keep the street swept, the shops attractive, and to have good people passing through. Sometimes the shops will chain hands, and that's very good, and that's what you've got to do. You've got to facilitate, enable. You're not a director in kind of film world, you're a producer. You bring together the resources and let other people flourish. That's my theory of what you're supposed to do. And I think you have to recognize that in a university like yours or this one, however good a degree you have, there is a group of people who are just way beyond it. And what you have to do is not to be threatened by that, but just to say, wow, and take pleasure in it.
When you say way beyond it, you mean people much cleverer than yourself?
Yeah, much cleverer. And you just delight in it because you are enough of an academic to see what their skills are. And really to enjoy it. So that's true for the fellows. Whether I've succeeded, I don't know, but that's what I would like to say. For the kids, it's rather the same. I mean, they are very talented. They are multi-talented, as I was trying to say last night. I think they are better rounded people than we were, more skills, the degree to which they've followed anything to any depth is much less than was true in our day. But I think the job of an Oxford or Cambridge college is to allow people to develop their own all-round talents to the highest degree. Now, that's not very easy to put down in terms of targets and achievements and whatever, but it's extremely important, it seems to me. It gives me pleasure when good people get firsts. It equally gives me pleasure when people act well, or play music well, or play sport well, or whatever. One of my children went to another college and told me that the address that's given by the head of house to freshers says, "You are here to work, 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 and work." And what I say to freshers is, if all you ever do while you're here in Oxford is work, you are wasting your time. If you never go into the Ashmolean, if you never go into the Playhouse, if you never go to a concert in the Sheldonian, you have wasted your time. Now, it's a different attitude to what it is we're trying to do. And I think we are trying to allow people room to grow under challenging circumstances. I think it's important we challenge them. It's extremely important. It wasn't true when we were undergraduates that they are challenged academically. We are much fiercer on their academic progress than we were. We take collections, both in terms of end-of-term reports and in terms of college examinations, much more seriously. They're invigilated, they're marked, and so on. It is much more competitive to get into the college than it was, and indeed one of the things I'm most proud about is that, partly as a consequence of this big building program I've led over the last 7 or 8 years, for the last 5 or 6 years we have had more applicants than any other college by quite a long way, and that gives us more choice, so we can choose really good people and make it a place where they then develop their talents. And when I contrast this with my younger stepdaughter who went to Sussex, now she was absolutely determined she wasn't going to Oxford or Cambridge. Her mother, her stepfather, her natural father, her uncle, everybody had been to Oxford or Cambridge. Absolutely not. Happy to go to Sussex, had the right course and so on. It didn't actually turn out to be the right course, but that's a different question. She's very tall, very athletic, very concerned with, not with sport, but with being fit. This sounds like a terribly old-fashioned view, but at Freshers' Week in any Oxbridge college, she would be put into a boat. She's tall, very long levers. She would have loved it. Equally, she has grade 8 clarinet. She'd been in a college orchestra. At Sussex, neither. She never touched her clarinet, because in a unitary university, you have to be very good to be in the university orchestra. In a collegiate university, you just have to be quite good. And I think that difference is the key thing that, in a way, differentiates and justifies the collegiate system, but it is, of course, hugely expensive. But it does allow people to have a go at something in a kind of unthreatened way.
And we've both had a go at something in an unthreatened way, which is my way of winding this up.
Yes.
And your philosophy is something which we generated those 50 years ago together.
Absolutely.
That university was more than work, and about friendship and music and love and so on. So it's been a delight to talk about it. Thank you very much indeed, Dave.
Alan, thank you for the privilege.